Magic is found in every room, where people connect over a shared purpose. In this weekly podcast, Luke, Hannah and Chris explore the role of purpose, courage, mindset and culture in every leader's quest for transformational performance.
Hello and welcome to Magic in the Room. I am Hannah Broderick.
And I'm Luke Freeman. And today we are super excited to have Annette Taylor on as a guest. She's an evolutionary psychologist and does some amazing writing. And I can't wait for listeners to hear from you, Annette. And I'm chomping at the bit here to ask questions and nerd out myself. But I want to give everyone some context first. So just as a reminder, listeners, this season 4 of Magic in the Room is all about intentional leadership. And if you remember, our definition of leadership is simply this, that you notice something that could be better, you make a conscious choice of how you're going to make things better, and then you follow through and have the courage to act. And so we spent a whole month just digging into that model, why we chose that model, what we think the benefits are. And now we've moved on to this idea that under the surface, there are things inside of us that really drive what we notice, the choices that we make, and when we have the courage to act and when we don't. And we really break those things into a couple categories. One is our personality, and another is the life experiences that we bring with us. And so if you haven't listened to the episode or two before this, we really dig into that. And today we're going to actually go even further under the surface, because underneath our unique personality, underneath our life experiences, we carry with us, and Annette, you can correct me if I say any of this wrong, we carry, in our brains and in our physiology, all of the history of humankind and what has helped us survive and make it to this day. And so I love this conversation around how do we dig off even another layer, go into the psychology that we carry with us from our ancestors, and learn to notice when our Caveperson is coming out and driving some of our decisions, so that we can be better about making choices. So I just want to give kind of my last thing before we turn it over to Annette is this might feel philosophical. It might feel super psychological nerd talk. If you're someone that's I just lead an organization and or I've got a family that I want to be a better leader for. I would say hold on, stick with us through this. And at the end, we are going to get really practical about, okay, how do you take this and really bring it into your day-to-day life? And because that's our goal, is to get some practical takeaways from the things that we learn. So with that, Annette, welcome. We're so glad that you're here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Let's see. We met, I think, on a virtual meeting several months ago. And whenever you introduced yourself, I was just like, oh my gosh, I have to learn more about this person. So I think I probably creepily Googled you during the meeting, and I found your website and your blogs and just read. I was like, oh, this is so good. And I think it was same day.
Yeah, and Luke also messaged me right away and said, we need to get Annette on the podcast. And I was
awesome.
Yes, let's do it.
Yes,
Yeah. So the day has come. So tell our listeners, Annette, who are you? What is it that you write about? And what are the things that you spend your time thinking about?
Okay. So I'm Annette Taylor. I have an online name, which is Penny. It's also my pen name. So some places I'm Penny, some places I'm Annette, but same person. I also have an inner cave dweller who I affectionately call Cave Girl Claire. And I discovered her about 6 years ago after a lot of research. I've always been interested in psychology. And I have a bachelor's in psychology. And then I went into early childhood education and I think got even more interested about what makes us tick. We all used to be kids. So I got to know children real well. And then I think at some level it still wasn't enough. Like I still wanted to know what really was happening with people. And so I got a master's in educational psychology, and then had an experience where I became obsessed with a couple actors, and essentially it was, how is this happening? Why am I obsessed with these people? And I discovered when I went back to do more research that they had a lot of attributes of good leaders, and it was good leadership that I was actually attracted to. And so I don't know, I just kind of took it from there, and I have a Medium page that I write on, and I have a website that is kind of fun, just introducing the ideas of, why we do some of the things we do, and how sometimes we're not aware of the reasons that we do those things.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting, all these different takes that the way you kind of make these thoughts and ideas come alive, right? Through the persona of Claire, the cave dweller, and how people can kind of interact with Claire through your website, asking Claire questions. We may do that a little bit later in the podcast here, ask Claire some questions and see what we learn. But what I find fascinating about just digging into some of your work and some of our conversations leading up to today is this idea. So we talk a lot about psychology, and that's your background, right?
Mhm.
Understanding what people take, but the importance of really understanding our biology in order to actually understand psychology, right? Because psychology comes
Mhm.
from, it's our mental states, our emotional states, it's our mind, the state of our mind, which all it's produced from our brain and our nervous system and really our bodies, right? I think we tend to think of those as all separate things, but biology is at the core of everything that we do,
Yeah,
think, say, feel,
yeah, it's
experience.
all synapses,
Yeah.
ultimately. Like
Yeah.
it's kind of weird to think about, but that's what I spend some of my time thinking about.
Awesome.
Yeah, so I know that you really dialed in on evolutionary psychology, and I know we have a quote here even that you came to believe that any kind of psychology has to be connected to the evolutionary context for it to be as useful as possible. So give us a little bit of insight. When someone hears evolutionary psychology, what is it that you mean? And maybe remind us a little bit about the history of our species. When we say evolutionary psychology, what periods of our history are we thinking about? And what are some of the contexts that most of humankind has lived in for most of the time we've been around on the planet?
Right. So sometimes I'll section like human history off into 3 sections. We had the tree dweller section, the cave dweller section, and what I call the house dweller section. And I don't mean to say that everyone lives in a house now. It's just kind of a way to characterize the time in history. Um, so the cave dweller time, as best as I can tell from my research, is around 200,000 years ago until 20,000 years ago. So during that time, we lived in small groups that were nomadic, isolated, and languageless for the most
Mm,
part. Speaking language. We had ways of communicating, but they were facial gestures, sounds, um, you know, the basics, right?
Yeah, that's
Before we
yeah.
got
actually
that.
a new thought to me. I had never actually thought about or realized that the cave dweller era, which from what you just described is much, much, much longer than the quote unquote modern house dweller era that we know,
Mm-hmm.
um, that humans did not have spoken language during that time.
90% of the time that we've been humans, and not necessarily Homo sapiens, because it took a little while for the Homo sapien species to kind of get dialed in. But for 90% of our time as people,
Mhm.
yeah, we were not using language.
Okay. So we did not have verbal language, but we had language and other forms of
Right.
communicating.
We
So,
could
and that, I
communicate.
think that whole idea is central to what we're going to talk about and how our personality experience drive what we notice, how we choose, and how we act, and also the central idea of leadership. What are the characteristics of a leader that people are drawn to? And as we're kind of diving a little deeper down under the surface of the iceberg here, we've used this iceberg analogy, right? What we see on the top of the iceberg is a small percentage of everything that actually drives our behavior. So, yeah, talk to us a little bit about what if human history precedes spoken language. How did we communicate? What were some of the ways that people, that leadership would emerge
Mhm.
in pre-language era?
Right. So, the way I characterize it a lot of times is just simply asking people to imagine. So, humans have, I call it, two superpowers. One is curiosity and one is imagination. And so it's basically just imagining what would life be like when we lived in these kind of groups. And just getting the parameters is kind of tricky, right? So let's say you lived in a nomadic tribe. Um, and actually my inner cave dweller, Claire, I kind of, on my website, if you go through my blog, um, it's her story. Like, she gets isolated, she has to choose a leader, and there are two kinds of leaders, and she has to pick a leader that essentially has the characteristic of a pre-language leader, or the characteristics of a leader who she could negotiate with, right? So the majority of our time, though, you were following and trying to keep up with a person who was experienced, and if you kept up with them, you would survive. That's pretty much it. But if you had a leader that turned around and went, "Hey, these people are following me," and was a little more inclusive, and like you started working together and getting coordinated, your tribe was stronger than the tribe that had a leader that was like, "Keep up if you want. Uh,
Keep up or
I'm going this
die.
way." Yeah. So
Yeah.
at some point, we went from this more like tree dweller, I call it tree dweller style of leadership. Yeah, sink or swim, to this more cave dweller where the group started being more important than the individual. And I think those two levels of leadership still exist.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I know as I was preparing for the episode, like when I read that part of your thoughts about pre-language leadership style and post-language leadership style, I was like, this captures so well the difference between, what we would call command and control, or high power distance, hierarchical, however you want to say it, and someone that is a little bit less command and control, maybe a flatter organization. Um, and like just today, like right before we started recording, I was on a call with the owner CEO of a small business, and we were talking about, this one project that's come up and how there are people inside the organization that all want their fingers in it. And he said, I heard from this one person that they're afraid if we give it to the other group, we're just going to be a fractured, siloed organization, and they want to have some influence on it. And I just said, like, I don't think that's how it works. Right? I think we can have role clarity and be more effective and all have each other's interests in mind. Like every week, my trash has to go out to the curb. Our trash and recycling has to go out. And all week long, between trash days, our trash can fills up and has to go in the bin to then go out to the curb that one day a week. And we could do it two ways. We could just everyone knows the trash has to go out when it's full to the bin, then it has to go out to the curb one day. Or what we've chosen is, hey, 14-year-old son, this is your job in our team. You need to be emptying the trash when you see it's full, and you need to get it out to the curb on this day. Now, does the fact that we have clearly defined his role make us more siloed or separated as a family? I don't think so, right? I have to remind him every week, right? People have to kind of work together. Just last night, he had a lot of homework, so he negotiated and got his brother to do it for him. But the fact that there's role clarity made us more effective. So
Right.
I'm just rambling about this to say I'm imagining the difference for Claire, like which leadership style are we going to take? Someone who muscles everything forward and just sees that the trash needs to go out as the most senior leader or most powerful leader and hits someone with a stick until they go do it. And it might be a different person any given week, or someone who uses like the technology of language, the technology of writing it up on a chore chart to say, this is your role. And now you're accountable to that role to help support our team. Like, we're still negotiating these different styles of leadership today. Whether it's my family, whether it's the CEO I'm talking to, or whether it's 20,000 years ago. So very interesting.
Yeah. And one of the things that I thought was interesting too is the idea that, yeah, these two different styles of leadership, the before language leadership habits and the, you know, after or post language when we have language leadership style. So before we could talk to each other, before we had language, competition ruled. It was a competition-based society. Whereas after we developed verbal language and could communicate, it became a more cooperative, or we often call it collaborative style of leadership. And you're right, those two things both exist today. And I think for me, what was important is to note that one isn't necessarily more evolved or quote unquote better than the other. They're both necessary and maybe necessary in different contexts, but understanding the origin of that is helpful, right? And it's also helpful in terms of understanding how people respond to those two different styles. So we can be intentional also as leaders about what type of choices we make in terms of leadership style and what context or situation calls for a different style from us. One thing that I kind of read in the notes here about, this thought on Dunbar's number and how that affects leadership habits. Can you just briefly explain Dunbar's number, why it has an effect on how we show up?
Okay, sure. So Dunbar's number is generally accepted at the number 150. Technically, it's 148.3 or something like that.
All right.
It's like
I had heard
almost
150. Great.
Yeah. So basically, it's the amount of people that most people can keep track of.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
situations like an army, you need the before language style.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's hierarchy based. You need it.
Yeah.
But if you're in a company, and I think this is interesting, like if you just kind of had this knowledge that Dunbar's number was if you please just played with it and went, let's see if this works. If you had a company and you have a large company, but you have your departments that are less than 150, maybe those departments will work a little better if you kind of keep that number in mind.
because we work with a lot of companies that are growing quickly and that are getting to the point of they're kind of scaling. And it is, you know, it's documented that once a company gets past that size of about 150 people, it gets much harder to lead, because one leader can't effectively lead more than 150 individuals.
Right.
And so that's where, when we see in large corporations where people often feel like they're just a number and they're not super engaged because they don't feel that direct connection. That is where individual unit leaders, right? Team leaders can make all the difference in the experience, the employee experience, team member experience, right? For individuals working there. If you work for a manager or a group leader that really is intentional about leading that unit, you can have a really positive experience, even working in a very large corporation. And I've read some interesting articles about, quote unquote, corporate universal culture versus local culture, right? In large companies where the local culture of your individual team or the branch or location that you're part of can have a very different experience from the overall corporate culture that exists. And that individual leader has a lot to do with the experience of the people around them. So yeah, I think it's interesting to look at that, right? This kind of magic Dunbar's number around 150 people when one unit gets larger than that. We have to
I think it's
about
something
how
to keep in mind. Like if you're
Yeah.
trying to organize people, and it's helpful too to have the say team leader um also be able to pull back and see the big picture once in a while. Like, yeah, let's say you're in charge of accounting. You have to be able to maybe have a little bit of hierarchy to keep things organized, but then be able to zoom out. So real quick, my favorite pandemic song that people were writing pandemic songs, famous people, is Ringo Starr, because he has the song Zoom In, Zoom Out. So if you have that middle management person that can zoom in, see what's happening inside their group, but then be able to pull back and not be in panic mode and pull back and see the big picture, you're a connector. I think that's the most important thing. Like if you're in a group, like a tribal group, you are going to have those people. You're going to have the leader out front making the decisions, but you're also going to have those people that are connecting the leader to the group. And I imagine that ancestral nomadic groups, they didn't have just one leader. In my mind, there had to be two or three, because what if the leader got picked off? Then you were up a stream with no paddle. So it's pretty specific to just imagining what it would be like. And I think it's totally useful.
Yeah, and I think with Dunbar's number as well, if that truly is our limit neurologically and biologically, with how many meaningful relationships we can manage, to think, okay, well, how many are reserved for our families and how many need to be reserved for peers? And then how many people can we effectively lead in
and
addition to that?
and friends, right? Let's not discount friendships,
Oh,
right? They
come
are
on,
also
Hannah.
part of
Who
our
has friends? You do. You have a lot
I
of
do.
friends, Hannah. So there's a lot of organizational design principles that I think flow out of that when we think about building a tier of collaborative management or executives in an organization. Like they have to reserve space for one another as well. Um, I'm curious about the incentives that our ancestors had for positive leadership, because I get the sense that today, if someone's managing towards maximizing profits or whatever the KPI of the organization is, There's a worst case scenario that probably looks like, if I'm a corporate leader, that I don't have a gig for a while, I have to find something else, I work with a recruiting company, I get plugged in another role somewhere else. Maybe worst case scenario is it's 10 or 20% less revenue than what I'm earning today. I get the sense that the worst case scenario was a little bit different, and there were some other incentives for people to lead with the community first. But I'd love to hear, test my assumptions on that, Annette.
Absolutely. There were not any monetary goals when you were in an ancestral group. I think the most important thing was to preserve as many people as possible. So I think a lot of people have this idea that living as a cave dweller was like harsh, and it certainly was. But I think within the group, it was it was like almost like us against them. Like, yes, there were predators that could eat you, and there were weather and surprises that all constantly, like constant surprises. But when you were with your tribe, you felt safer and you wanted as much safety as possible. And that meant like making sure that everyone was healthy and everyone was eating and you know what I mean? So it is very different. And I think that if you own a company and you have monetary gains as your goal, your employees are going to figure it out pretty quickly. So if you have maybe like a secondary goal or a goal that is about keeping your employees healthy and happy, I don't understand why that would be a disadvantage. Like when you have a company that's too hierarchical or too big or too monetarily focused, then you're going to have a problem retaining people. And how is that good for your company?
People intuitively know what we do know what's good for us, right? Even if we're not always 100% aware of the choices that we make in terms of what's good for us, there is a visceral experience of we know when someone has our best interest in mind or not. On some level we do, right? And people feel it in those types of organizations where there isn't necessarily a genuine care for, or it's not a primary goal to care for the people that work in the organization and produce the outcomes, right? We like to think of, I mean, if you are a for-profit business, you do have to make a profit, but a profit is an outcome of a chain of events that really starts with the internal team member experience, right? What is their experience of working here? Is this a group that because we kind of skirted around this issue, but every human being is hardwired to be part of a group, right? I think that's part of that prehistoric wiring that we have from the cave dweller societies, that's how we survive, is by being part of a group. And so our survival instinct says we need to be part of a group. And our survival instinct also is pretty acutely attuned to, is this leader someone that has my best interest in mind? Does this group have my best interest in mind?
Mhm.
Yeah, to go back to kind of underline that point. Yeah, if your plan B as a leader is not be part of the group, like that works today, that wasn't really a very good option, right? Is what I'm hearing you say. Like life on your own was not going to be a very long life.
No.
And also the people that you have are the people that you have. And the only way to replace someone, replacing someone who you lose is what, a 10, 12, year process.
Yeah.
So to get someone who can fill roles for your group.
Mhm.
So I like the thought experiment for leaders to say, what if, the 20 people I have, or the 50 people I have, or the 100 people I have, what if they were my only option? How would I think about performance development differently? How would I think about accountability differently? How would I think about strategy differently? How would I use my time differently if I didn't have other options? And then to think, okay, well, that was the reality for most of human history. And so, in some ways, the way that we're thinking about people as resources, right? I have a little bit of a gut reaction to just the phrase human resources, is a very modern and outlier approach to how leaders have thought about their people in the past.
Yeah. I mean, the brutal reality is that people were resources back then. It's
Mm,
just that the difference was if you had a leader that kind of appreciated that, or a leader that didn't exactly appreciate that. So what's funny is like in more recent history, like we talk about monarchies. Monarchies are totally hierarchical,
yeah.
but it was necessary because all of the resources were behind a castle wall. And so you had to have that trickle down. But if you know that is just an option, and you can imagine this other option, you might not want that type of hierarchy-based leader. You might want the leader that's more group-oriented.
Yeah, let's talk about hierarchy because there's much debate about what's better, a hierarchical uh, style of organization or a quote unquote flat organization without a lot of hierarchy. Why does hierarchy matter to humans from an evolutionary perspective? And yeah, maybe we should debate that, which is better, hierarchical or not.
Yeah. Real quick before I answer that, I I have not a problem, but what's better, what's worse? Like it depends. Not only is it contextual, like what's better, what's worse, but when you talk about what's better, what's worse, you're putting it in a hierarchy. So
Mm,
I'm trying to like
yeah. So
just
when
make
we
people
assign
aware.
value, we're
Yeah,
already
you're
assigning
already, yeah.
hierarchy. Yeah.
So
Great
hierarchy
observation.
was 100% necessary, especially when we couldn't talk to each other. It was our only way of organizing a group.
Hmm.
You do this, you do that, you do that, then we go. And we go and we go and we go and we go. Till someone drops dead and someone, the whole, it's basically how, I mean, animals don't have language. You're talking about dogs or whoever.
Yeah.
There's hierarchy, you need it. But we're people. Like, let's mix it up a little bit. Let's try negotiating instead of just filling a role and doing that role over and over. Like in my head, cave dwellers had to be a little more flexible because maybe you lost a couple people when they went out to get fire or whatever. Um, then you had to like, I don't think as cave dwellers, we had one job. I think you had to be good at multiple jobs because you didn't know who was going to be left at the end of the day, and all the jobs had to be done, right?
Yeah. Well, this is super fascinating. And I know we've really focused in on leadership here, different styles of leadership and sort of the evolutionary psychology of how we think about leaders and leading. But I know a lot of your work has to do with noticing our inner cave person that we're carrying around with us and listening to that cave person and having the insight to be able to make better choices because of that. So, tell us a little bit about that. When we say there's an inner cave person, or when you say Claire's your inner cave person, what do you mean by that? Why do we have an inner cave person, and what role do they play in our day-to-day lives?
Very good question. Um, Basically, I see everyone having an inner cave person that's about, I'm going to call it 20% of the choices we make every day. We're not really exactly aware of all of the motivations for our behavior. And in my mind, it's 20%. So 20% of me is ancient, is pre-wired, um, and I accept her. And I think a lot of people, they don't like when they don't feel in control. They don't like feeling like there's something they don't know about. Especially nowadays with our phones, we know where our friends are. We know what time it is. We know what day it. We know everything. Everything. We don't know everything. So I just kind of like to honor that portion of me that doesn't know, that's ready for anything. And I think we all have this part. And she tends to be a little jumpy, but that's her job. So I just kind of accept her. And when she pops up and is scared of something new, I'm like, wow, okay. And you might even have a reaction that you initially don't control. And I think that's okay. Like, I have accepted this part of me that might just overreact to something initially, but especially if you're a leader, I think it's your responsibility to say, whoa, okay, that really startled me. I shouldn't have done A or B. Give me a minute. I'm going to try that again. And just accepting your biological reaction to surprises. And it's funny, in modern life, the more things we think we control, the more things are going to surprise us. Like, it's very jarring to have an appointment be canceled or someone not show up when they said they were, because we're so used to knowing what's going to happen next. And when it doesn't, then we have this fear reaction sometimes, and we don't even know it's fear.
Right. I love that. And so you touched on fear, which was going to be my next question. What role does fear play for our inner cave dweller person?
Right. So it's basically a way to get your attention. So if something's unexpected, you're kind of primed to say, that's dangerous. I didn't expect that. That was dangerous. That's kind of wired into our minds. We just don't know it. There's this thing called instinct blindness, and we all have it. And I've just kind of focused on it a little bit in my research and stuff. So it's useful, but it's an overreaction most of the time. You just have to take responsibility for the overreaction and go from there. And if you're a leader that can do that, that'd be great.
Yeah. So let's dig into that. Can you talk a little bit more about what is instinct blindness?
Sure. Basically, it's the things that we do and we don't know why.
Okay. Yeah.
It's when we have an automatic reaction to something that we almost surprised us because it's maybe uncharacteristic of how we typically would respond. But all of a sudden, here we are, very reactive.
Because someone is trying to help you and save you and protect you. And that's your inner cave dweller.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's good and sometimes it's not so good.
Exactly. It can be helpful. It can be unhelpful. We're going to talk in a future series of episodes in this season. We're going to talk about survival instincts and really what happens when we are under pressure, under stress, and the different ways that we react. So we'll talk about fight, flight, freeze type of responses and how we can build awareness around what triggers that for us, right? And it's just great that we have this context now of the inner cave dweller who really is jumpy because she is very attuned to anything that could be dangerous, right? We talk about it in the context of our brains are trying to keep us safe. And I think that's true for this inner cave dweller. Her goal is to keep us safe and keep us aware of anything that could be dangerous outside and also internally, right? Paying attention to the what's going on inside of us.
And that's called introception, being aware of what's going on inside of you. And since I've kind of been looking at life from this cave dweller perspective, I feel like I've gotten a little better at that.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear an example of that. And I know you've given a couple already. One is, the attraction to these leaders that you saw and like, why am I so attracted to them? Why do I feel so committed to them? Another is, when we feel something that maybe is making us nervous. But do you have any other kind of, what's a case study, a time that you were like, why am I acting this way? And realized, oh yeah, that's Claire trying to watch out for me.
Trying to think of a time I've overreacted recently. I would say with my kids, it comes up a lot because, that whole mama bear thing is real. Um, if someone messes with my kid, that's a thing. So I might kind of lash out and be like, no, that is not your place. So
Yeah.
then the hierarchy kicks in, right? Like if someone tries to tell me something, I should do something with my kid, or my kid's doing something wrong. It's like, that's my kid. And
Mhm.
it's like, "Grr." That's
Yeah,
probably a
no,
good
that's
example.
that's really interesting because yeah, so what I'm hearing you say is Claire perceives that risk as, okay, if we were 20, 40,000 years ago, um, someone disagreeing with my child or thinking something needs to happen differently with my child or not liking them means they might get less food or they might get sent on a more risky assignment or whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
It truly is an existential, life-threatening item.
And the hierarchy doesn't go away. It's just it changes a little bit. It's not the entire focus. And
Yeah. So let's do a little bit of Ask Claire, if that's okay.
yeah, cool.
I can kick us off. So I've been thinking about this one. This one's fresh. So I had to get on a call early this morning with someone that I was negotiating a lease agreement with. And I'll spare everyone of all of the context, but suffice it to say, I'm trying to help a client negotiate this lease with a much more powerful entity that really could say, you don't have access to the space anymore, like a week from today. So it's very kind of immediate. And I woke up early this morning, kind of thinking about this, feeling some stress about it. And I kept telling myself, listen, like this is a lease conversation. It's not life or death. Everything will be okay. The worst case scenario is really not that bad. And I would tell myself that. And then I'd 2 minutes later realize, gosh, I am still like nervous and stressed out about this. So give me some insight here. Like what might be happening? What's the inner caveman inside Luke, trying to do?
That's the feelings. Like it's kind of it's a good example of you can't always be in control of yourself 100%. And you nailed it. Like you said, I know this isn't a life-threatening situation, but you can't stop thinking about it. Because at some level, your inner cave dweller is like, wait a second, this is not supposed to be happening. This is an unexpected occurrence. And since there's nothing else to focus on that's, that's bad in your life, I think that's why we end up worrying a lot too. It's like we're out of things to really feel threatened by, like existentially. So these other things that happen all of a sudden seem like a really big deal.
That's super interesting because one thing that we advise clients is to help people get stress out.
Yes.
And e- even if it's something, if they're stressed about something they can't control. So I'm going to go back to pandemic, summer of 2020 with, race relations in the US, like lots of stressful stuff going on. And we had clients that were in the midst of like, are we going to have to do layoffs? How do we respond to what's happening socially? And you know what we said is like, come up with something. Come up with a project. It can be totally unrelated to those things, but like give people something to do that requires a little bit more work, a little bit more energy because they need a way to like work their stress out by doing something.
Yeah.
And
We are built
so
to work.
yeah, yeah.
We are built to
So I
do stuff.
love that applied personally. Like you
Yeah.
can't get rid of the feelings. If the feeling keeps coming up, where do you apply that energy differently to like, throw the caveman a bone a little bit and like let him work the energy out. So
Yeah. I think that's why some people like exercising.
Mm-hmm.
They
Yeah.
just kind of intuitively know it's like, pens up. Some people smoke. Some people binge shows so they don't have to think about real life. There's lots of coping things we do, but it's really all rooted in our biology. We just
Yeah. And as we'll explore, in a future episode, some of those coping mechanisms are helpful and some are not. Sometimes they were helpful at one point and then they have become unhelpful if we continue to do them and they actually become harmful. And so, but they're rooted in a way for the brain or for our biology to
Mhm.
protect us and keep us safe.
And if more people knew about that we're all like this, I think we'd get along so much better.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm. Mm.
I love that. And then and then the more we become aware for ourselves, right? What is driving some of that? Then when we are aware, we can make a choice, right? We can't make a choice about something we're not aware of. So notice, then we can choose how to act or behave and recognize that we may have more helpful options available to us
Right.
in
But
the
accept
situation.
the initial reaction, even if it's
Yeah.
inappropriate, because sometimes we can't help it.
Yeah,
Mm.
right. All right. So I'm going to ask Claire.
Okay.
One of the things that tends to trigger me and get me to overreact, and I think it's often our family and the people that we care about the most that tend to push our buttons, right? So one of the things when where my logic doesn't isn't helping me, when I just can't let go of something, it's always when my partner says he's going to be home at a certain time and then he's not home when he said he was going to be home. And now I know him, I trust him, he's never done anything to hurt me. He's a very social person. He'll run into somebody and have a conversation and like things can take a lot longer than I expect. And I fully know this about him. And yet every time he says, I'll be home in this amount of time or around this time,
Mhm.
my brain starts keeping track and I'm looking at the clock and I can't let it go. And I get jumpy, reactive. So I'm asking Claire, what's driving that?
Social contract,
Mm.
which were very, very, very important in a
Okay.
nomadic group. So
Interesting.
that's all that is. In my mind, it's like you said you would A,
Mm-hmm.
and you're not.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're like, something's wrong. You let me down.
Yeah.
And it's hard not to take things personally. Like people say, don't take it personally. It's like, I mean, if you said one thing and you do another thing, that's not so great. And it was life or death if you didn't do those things
Right.
in a nomadic group.
Yeah.
So you kind of, I don't know, it's just if you know that about now, you know that about yourself, and you can go, okay, wait, this isn't a matter of life and death,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe it'll change it a little. I don't know, but
Yeah.
what I see.
All right. Well, I promised people at the beginning we would get really practical. And I've loved this conversation up to this point. And, I'm committed to moving forward and just like trying to get to know Caveman Luke a little bit better. And first job is I have to come up with a cool name for him. So I got to work on that.
Yeah, who's your alter
Um,
ego?
yeah. Yeah. But let's get practical for folks. How do people notice when that caveman has kind of wrenched away the controls a little bit? Um, any practices that have been helpful to you or anything that you would suggest just in becoming better at noticing some of these things that are a little bit that we're typically less conscious of?
Yeah, that is tricky. I think we're kind of socially wired to pay attention to what's happening around us instead of what's happening inside us.
Mm,
And I don't know, it's hard to describe, but it's like just go through life. And a lot of it's about trust, and trust takes time. We have all these tools like smartwatches that will tell us what's happening inside our bodies, but we're not really listening to our bodies. We're looking at our watches. And you can actually get a decent amount of information from your body without a smartwatch.
Mm.
When you're tired, when you're hungry, when you're thirsty, these are all things that we can know enough about to get by. Does that make sense? There's like a perfectionist layer of in modern society that things need to be perfect. And I've just come to imagine that it really doesn't need to be perfect.
Yeah.
That's
But
super
I,
interesting because it's just a reminder that there's so much data there at our access if we notice it. And I know there's research about Aboriginal tribes in Australia that are just really good at wayfinding. And they have actually named, I don't know what it is, 20, 30 directions. So for us, we've got the 4 cardinal directions. And then we might say, oh, it's southwest, it's, northeast. So we really have kind of 8 key directions that we talk about, but they've really got it down to slivers because they're so connected with their environment. And I even remember as a child being super attuned to which direction was north in whatever setting I was in, almost
Mm.
like I could feel it, and I don't know if
Mhm.
that's true or not, but I felt this sense through my teenage years and 20s of that slipping away and having to get
Mhm.
more intentional about wayfinding myself. Um, but knowing that that data is still there, it still lives inside my body. I just haven't practiced listening to it.
Yeah.
And
Your
so,
body is the best tool. I think
yeah,
in modern life, especially Western society, we have way too many tools. We're dependent on tools. We don't need all these tools, in my mind.
that's interesting. Yeah, because this is fascinating to me because I have never had a strong sense of direction. And Luke, still to this day, I know this. He is a very, very good wayfinder. I always trust Luke to find directions. And so yeah, I don't know, like we're different in that, but I'm also someone who has had to learn to listen to my body and pay attention to that because as a child I was much more cerebral and I lived in books and would you know I loved just kind of doing these flights of fantasy and my mind would wander and I was much more interested maybe in like what was going on inside my brain in terms of just like actual stories that I was reading, and had to really learn to pay attention to what was going on in the rest of my body, right?
That's
And so
great.
learning to pay attention and all the things that we can notice about our the state of our nervous system through our biological responses, right? How are we breathing? Is our breathing fast and shallow or deep and relaxed? How is our body positioned, right? Doing body scan of noticing different tensions in our bodies or how our shoulders might be hunched or head down or um our posture, right?
Yeah.
And
Checking in. I
noticing,
keep doing that.
yeah, I do too, right? But those things not only send signals to our brain and inform us, but they also send signals to the people around us, right? So back to a leadership perspective, when we become more aware of and noticing what's happening in our body, we can be more intentional about how we carry ourselves and the energy that we put out into the world to the people around us.
And it's not always about controlling it either. It's about accepting it.
Yeah.
And when you talk about your 3 steps, the noticing, choosing, acting, there's kind of a bump between the noticing and the choosing. You
Mhm.
can't always choose your reaction.
Right.
mm,
You just have to be responsible for it.
Yeah.
mm,
I love that distinction. Yeah. So taking responsibility for our reactions and sometimes, like in your example earlier, owning that reaction, accepting it, and maybe asking for grace to try again.
Yep. And as a leader, giving grace when someone panics.
Yeah.
You're like, I don't think you were yourself right then. Let's just take a breath. If you could say that again, how would you say it?
I love it.
Yeah. Super practical. And I'm just so grateful for this conversation. So things that I've heard today, we all have to practice listening to our inner cave person, noticing when they take control, um, noticing when other people have let their cave person, or even if they've tried not to, right? Their cave person has jumped in and taken the reins for a moment. Noticing socially how we connect with one another and what those needs are, the needs for safety, security, meaning, belonging that we find in groups, and how do we as leaders create groups and teams that meet those needs and also meet the goals of the group and team. There's so much to dig into, and I'll say, after reading, on your Medium page and your website, like there's just a lot of great takeaways and a lot of reflection. So how do people get connected with you, Annette, and how would they follow you? And I know, share a little bit too about how they can ask Claire, hey, this thing happened. And I reacted in a way that was surprising to me. What would Claire say? Like, why did that happen?
Yep.
So how do people find you?
So I'm writing on Medium. On Medium, my name, since my pen name is Penny, I'm Penelope A. Taylor. So if you happen to be on Medium, that's me. I have a couple things on Google Scholar. They are blog posts that I wrote that you can find on my website, which is called cavedwellerclub.com. My whole story's there about Claire, how I found her, why she came into my life, how she affects it. And it's not just my story. I write in a way that people can plug themselves into. So I try to make it as inclusive as possible, obviously. It also has references that I've read. It has books I've read since I wrote my blog that I call resources that are also as a page on my website for that. And there's Ask Claire. So you can just go in, and if you had something unexpected happen to you, my inner cave dweller might be able to clarify or maybe make it less scary or confusing, whatever happened. I don't give advice. I don't say, yes, you should quit, no, you shouldn't quit. But I just kind of bring it back to the basics. That makes sense.
Yeah. Love it.
I also have a friend, I have to plug this. She wrote a book called 30 Days of Noticing, which is the first step in your system. And it's not really specifically about leadership, and I hope it doesn't step on toes, but it's a blue and orange, my friend Alana. It's a workbook. It's not even like a lot of reading. It's almost like journaling. So it's this really handy little workbook that I get to play.
I love it. I'm gonna get the book. It sounds great. 30 Days of Noticing by Alana Sheeran. So thank you again, Annette, for this thoughtful conversation. I just want to build on, Luke's takeaway of noticing. For me, the big takeaway was noticing with acceptance and not judgment, right? So noticing what we notice about ourselves and other people, accepting what is without judging the behavior and the reaction, and trying to enter into both the relationship with ourselves and the relationships with people around us and people that we lead from that frame of mind of paying attention, noticing without judgment, and then choosing our behavior in response when sometimes we can't choose our reaction, but we can choose our response to the reaction and to the situation. So Super, super helpful. I want to remind listeners that we do have a reflection guide that's available. That is a free companion guide to this episode and this series of episodes. You can download that on magicintheroom.com so you can follow along and interact with our content. You can find us, Purpose and Performance Group. Our website is purposeandperformancegroup.com. You can find us on LinkedIn, on Facebook, and on Instagram. All right, Luke, why don't you sing us out?
All right, I'll read us out. Magic in the Room is hosted by MIA Chris Province, Hannah Broderud, and Luke Freeman, produced by Ben West. Our theme music is by Evan Grimm. You can find his music on Apple Music. Magic in the Room is a production of Purpose and Performance Group. Find us at purposeandperformancegroup.com. You can find previous episodes at magicintheroom.com. And thanks so much for joining us today. We will see you next time.